Good morning. Let me welcome you all very cordially on the first day of our conference. This conference is a summary of the pilot project related to the Integrity Pact. Integrity Pact in the EU, Results and Perspectives. That's the conference title. We will together think about what we learned during the 5 years of monitoring of a very intensive public procurement project. Before we move on to the details, let me invite you to watch a short clip recorded by the European Commission. The Commission was the author of the idea, provides grants for the project, and we would like to hear a summary from a Commission's representative.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure to participate and welcome you at this very important event, which marks the successful conclusion of your Integrity Pact Pilot project. A closing event for you and a first encounter for me, since I joined DG Regio as a Director for Administrative Capacity Building and Programs Implementation only this September. EU cohesion policy contributes significantly to public investment in Europe and in your country. We need to ensure that Member States make the best possible use of the EU funds and achieve the greatest possible impact on citizens' lives. To do that, we need strong public bodies and good administrative capacity, but also new ways of working by involving all the stakeholders and the civil society. And this is where the idea of the Integrity Pacts is coming from. They aim to improve public procurement and to give civil society organizations a role to play in public decision-making. In 2016, together with Transparency International, we launched the Integrity Pacts pilot project. 18 Integrity Pacts were signed in 11 member states to monitor projects co-financed by the structural and cohesion funds. The Integrity Pacts focus on public procurement as it is of particular concern. It represents 14% of the EU GDP and around 48% of the European structural and investment funds are spent through public procurement. Yet, in many countries across the EU, we see that citizens lack confidence in the quality and objectiveness of public investment. And this is why tackling fraud and corruption and ensuring efficient and transparent public procurement is so important. Close cooperation between the authorities and the civil society can be an important step in the right direction. And this is the idea and the primary goal of the Integrity Pacts. The overall pilot project of the Integrity Pacts is coming to an end. Most of the projects involved in the pilot are reaching a stage of maturity. We begin to have a clear view of the impact it had on the ground. The final report, lessons learned and conclusions will be published soon. The Integrity Pacts have already been recognized and praised, and they even received the European Ombudsman Award for Good Administration in 2019. However, this task is by far not over, even more so today when Europe and the world are facing the worst crisis in a long time. We are in a defining moment for both current and future investments. And we need all the tools that will support our recovery efforts. Integrity Pacts are one of these tools. The Commission will encourage and support the authorities of Member States to use Integrity Pacts in a more systematic fashion in the new programming period. Thank you for your attention and for being part of this project.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you heard, we will be talking about a very interesting tool aimed at social control over the spending of public money. The tool is also aimed at engaging citizens in scrutinizing the expenditure process. This is a two-day conference. We decided that today we will mostly focus on the Polish part of it. We will summarize it together with the main actors of the project. We're engaged in monitoring on the part of the contractor, the contracting authority, and also the managing authority. We will move on to that in around 15 minutes. That's when the panel will start. And we will also invite you to ask questions in our discussion via Facebook and via YouTube. We'll try to forward your questions to our panelists.
zaczniemy
However,
tą
before
część,
we move on to that
to
part,
chciałbym jeszcze może
I would like
chwilę
to spend a
czasu
couple of minutes
poświęcić właśnie
giving
na
you
takie
some
wprowadzenie,
introductory picture.
opowiedzenie
I would
o
like to
tym,
tell you more
czym ten
about
Pakt
what the
Pakt
Integrity
Uczciwości
Pact
faktycznej
really
jest,
is,
jakie były
its
jego założenia
assumptions
na początku
at the very
projektu,
beginning of the project,
z czym my się mierzyliśmy
things
jako
that we had
Fundacja
to struggle
Batorego,
with
która
as the
została
Batory
takim
Foundation. We
społecznym
were the
obserwatorem
social
zamówienia,
observer of the
jakiego rodzaju była
project.
to
I will
inwestycja
tell you more about the investment
i jakie
itself
skutki
and
ten
about the
projekt przyniósł
consequences of the project
dla
in
przejrzystości,
terms of transparency,
dla większej
integrity,
uczciwości, dla większej sprawności
efficiency
realizacji
of
tego konkretnego zamówienia
implementation of
publicznego
that particular public
i czy
procurement
wnioski
project.
z tego projektu mogą być też
And I'll also try to address the question whether conclusions drawn can be replicated elsewhere
czy też w przyszłości, jeżeli
in other
Pakt Uczciwości
projects
będą w Polsce
in the future.
kontynuowane, a mamy nadzieję, że będą
Let me
i to pewnie
express my
będzie jeden
hope
z
that
dzisiejszych
we
punktów do dyskusji. Także jeśli
have
mógłbym
more
prosić
Integrity
o
Pacts in
prezentację.
Poland in the future. And now let me move on to my presentation.
Dzisiaj, tak jak mówiłem,
As
o
I
pilotażu Paktu
said, we will
Uczciwości w
focus
Polsce,
on the
czego
pilot
nauczyliśmy się o
project of the
Pakcie
Integrity
i
Pact
o
in
realizacji
Poland,
zamówień
what we
publicznych.
learned about
Tylko
public
krótko jeszcze
procurement
może, bo
implementation.
tutaj w filmiku Komisji
In
Europejskiej
the clip
mieliśmy to
by the
dosyć
European Commission,
dokładnie
it was
powiedziane,
clearly
jaki był
stated
początek
what
w
the
ogóle
beginnings of the
projektu.
project
Projekt
were.
jest inicjatywą
This is the
Komisji
initiative of the
Europejskiej.
European Commission.
Chodziło o przetestowanie
The main aim
narzędzia,
was to test
które
a certain
miało
tool
pozwalać na
that should
społeczny
allow for social monitoring of
wybranych
selected
zamówień
public
publicznych.
procurement.
Sama metodologia
The
tego
methodology
monitoringu
of
i jej główne założenia, one
monitoring
zostały
and its main
opracowane dużo
assumptions had
wcześniej
been
przez
prepared
organizację,
well before that
która zajmuje się
by an
stricte przeciwdziałaniem
organization
korupcji, Transparency
that fights
International
corruption, namely Transparency
ta organizacja
International.
i jej oddziały na
This
całym świecie
organization
wcześniej
and its
tego
branches
rodzaju
worldwide had
mechanizmy
tested
testowały,
similar mechanisms
przede wszystkim w
before.
krajach,
This was done
można
in
powiedzieć,
particular in the
trzeciego
less
świata,
developed
głównie, gdzie
countries
problem z korupcją,
that
problem z
struggle
nadużyciami jest
with
szczególnie duży.
abuse and corruption and
Natomiast
bribery.
Komisja Europejska postanowiła też
The European
sprawdzić,
Commission
na
decided to
na ile
check
właśnie to
to what
narzędzie
extent
kontroli
such a
społecznej
tool of
można
social control
wykorzystać
could
w
be
tym środowisku
applied within the legal and
instytucjonalnym, bardzo
institutional
specyficznym, jaki
framework of
stanowi obszar Unii
the
Europejskiej.
European Union.
Do pilotażu zgłosiło się 11 krajów,
11 countries,
Polska,
including Poland,
za sprawą
applied
wtedy
to
ówczesnego
participate in
Ministerstwa
the project.
Inwestycji,
Back
które
then
już
this
tyle
was
razy po
done through the
drodze
Ministry of
zmieniało
Investment,
swoją
but
nazwę,
throughout the
więc
years
chyba
the ministry changed
bardziej
its name
precyzyjnie
so many
będzie,
times
jeśli
that
powiem, że za
I should
sprawą
actually say that it was the
instytucji
managing authority of
programem
the
operacyjnym
operational program
Infrastruktura i Środowisko,
Infrastructure and Environment.
z którego to programu monitorowany projekt był potem
The project that we monitored belonged to that program.
Do monitoringu.
We will have a chance to give you more information about it as we have with us a representative of the managing authority, Mr. Marcin Szymański. But that's how it all started. Poland enrolled together with 10 other countries in the pilot project. In Poland, it was decided that a railroad project would be monitored, an infrastructure project. 50% of its financing comes from the Cohesion Fund, from the EU. In other countries, the projects were varied. In some countries, these were infrastructural projects, for instance, modernization of a motorway, construction of a tunnel. However, there were also projects based on, for instance, construction of an archaeological park that focused on historical monuments, modernization of a hospital, for instance. The array of projects that were monitored in the EU was pretty wide. Project participants included 15 CSOs. Like the Batory Foundation, their role was that of a social observer. Each of these organizations concluded so-called Integrity Pact with the Contracting Authority. Integrity Pact is the topic of the day. It's an undertaking of all parties to the Pact, that is both the contracting authority, the observer, and the contractor at a certain stage, to obey the highest standards of transparency, integrity. There are also certain obligations undertaken towards the observer, for instance, sharing knowledge, information, responding to citizens' questions, attending meetings with local communities that are impacted by a given investment. On the whole, parties to the pact undertake to cooperate to make sure that the procurement is implemented in a responsible manner with respect of integrity rules, EU money, and also in a manner that mitigates all potential risk related to irregularities, bribery and corruption. These were the assumptions of the project. The pact was aimed at providing protection against irregularities, abuse and corruption in public investments, or at least allowing the detection of such irregularities at a possibly early stage so as to mitigate potential damages. This general assumption, however, includes very detailed elements of the pact, things that the European Commission decided to test live in Europe. For instance, including transparency, accountability for spending the funds, enhancing trust to public authorities. If public authorities agree to scrutiny, to being monitored under the Integrity Pact, they give a clear message to the public opinion. We have nothing to hide. We play by the book. We keep higher standards of spending public money. Somehow that enhances public trust towards such institutions. It also builds market trust towards such institutions, and that translates, for instance, to their better competitiveness on the tender market. Indeed, that was one of the assumptions of the Pact. If a given contract is included or has an integrity pact, business entities that are interested in that particular tender have reason to believe that the project will be carried out in a manner that does not give special privileges, does not favor any entities, there's no room for corruption, collusions, etc. Consequently, the readiness to participate in public procurement projects should be higher on the part of the business. The reputation is enhanced, competitiveness is increased. However, such projects can also bring tangible savings. The role of a social observer is, all in all, to react to any kinds, intended or unintended, of wasting of public money. It's a certain idea behind the monitoring activities carried out by the Batory Foundation since 2016. As I've already mentioned, the investment in question was a railroad one, namely it was a modernization project of 44-kilometer stretch of railroad between Zawiercie and Częstochowa. The tender was announced in November 2016. Right before that, the Batory Foundation concluded an integrity pact with the Polish railroad company PKP. Under the Pact, the Polish railroad company undertook certain obligations toward our foundation, for instance, making tender documentation available, contract documentation, correspondence, etc., attending meetings with representatives of the foundation, reacting to potential questions, recommendations. Based on the Pact, representatives of the Batory Foundation were allowed to act as observers in the tendering committee. The Pact was concluded in November 2017, and it was actually valid until the end of September this year. We went through all the stages of the tender project, starting from the tendering phase, analysis of documentation, selection of the bidder, signing the contract with the contractor. At that stage, we were joined by a US company. By placing their bid, they also agreed to certain future obligations towards the social observer. The contract specimen, which was part of the tender documentation, included obligations strictly related to the Integrity Pact. Starting from July 2017, we had a US company, the contractor, on board, but we also had project engineer by signing the engineering supervision contract. This entity also undertook to, for instance, provide information about claims or ongoing project correspondence to the observer. We went through the tendering stage, the stage of signing the contract, and the investment that we were monitoring was indeed demanding because of its character. The contractor not only had to construct the facility, but also design it. There was plenty of technical documentation. Luckily, our foundation was able to avail of technical and legal consultants. The consultants helped us enter the world of infrastructural projects. With expert support, we were trying to be up to date when it came to what was happening. We attended meetings at the construction site. We organized meetings with parties to the Pact. We would ask questions about some doubts, changes to the timeline, unclear situations related to the project, any negligence that might pose a risk to the public interest. On the implementation stage, we went through the designing phase and the final phase, that is the construction phase, followed by acceptances. We would visit the construction site. We were trying to be there mostly in Częstochowa, on location. It was there that most of the activities related to the investment took place. We met partners. We held talks about our take, our perspective on the investment and its implementation. And last but not least, the acceptance phase took place this year. We were an active party to that. We gave our perspective on the course of that stage, and it was all summarized in two monitoring reports. The first report focused on the tendering phase. It was published last year. This year we are almost ready with the final monitoring report, highlighting the problems, the challenges that we had to face. I already gave you some information about the monitoring itself. When it comes to financing, the cost of 5-year monitoring was 1.2 million Polish zlotys. If you compare that with the cost of the entire investment, that is construction works and engineering supervision carried out by the project engineer throughout the entire investment, you see that it's just a small fraction of the total amount of money that was spent on that investment. It's just 0.3%. It was the cost of social monitoring. However, that was not only monitoring, let me underscore that.
trzeba zaznaczyć, bo
Our monitoring was really extensive in nature. We not only focused on reviewing current documentation, but we were also trying to prepare for own needs at the request of the contracting authority, own opinions related to certain disputes, doubts that might occur during project implementation. We always tried to be in touch with the local community. We would attend meetings in localities through which the railroad would run. We met people from Poraj, Myszków, Częstochowa. We presented the effects of our monitoring to local inhabitants who had a chance to ask direct questions from questions to PKP, to ZUE. We gave information about the idea of whistleblowing. Potential whistleblowers were able to contact us anonymously. We would then investigate the matters. We would also publish amicus curiae positions. One case related to not providing information to the contractor. In our opinion, this should have been treated as public information, and that's where we presented our amicus curiae statement. We provided support for corporate procedures of ethical governance. We worked with the contractor aimed at protecting whistleblowers in the company, in particular in the field of the project that we were monitoring. Later on, that was expanded to include also other areas of the company's operation, and all in all, they took shape of complex ethical management policy. We're also trying to exchange our views on how to prevent and monitor conflict of interest with PKP, the Polish Railroad Company. Wherever we saw potential for fighting abuse and corruption among our partners, we would be ready to help to support them. And of course, we organized open seminars and conferences. This was another achievement of the Integrity Pact, and today's conference is the best proof of what we did. To conclude, let me now focus on the key conclusions and dilemmas that we observed during our work. First of all, there is no foundation in the legal system for the Integrity Pacts, and that was an obstacle at certain stages of monitoring. For instance, we were thinking on how we as social observers could participate in the works of the European Commission. The public procurement law does not mention this topic at all. In other words, we had to be more detailed in our pact that we concluded with the Polish Railroad Company. Luckily, our partners were very flexible and understanding, and we managed to have the observers' presence rooted in the regulations related to the tendering committee. Our second doubt is that perhaps we joined the procedure too late. From other countries, we receive recommendations. They say that it's best to include the social observer as early as possible, not right before the announcement of the tender, but earlier at the stage of preparing tender documentation, when the feasibility study is developed. That's also the time when consultations are carried out with local communities related to a specific investment. We were not present there. The timeline of the investment that we monitored did not allow us to be present at an earlier stage as an observer. However, our recommendation would be to engage the observer from the very beginning, already on the phase of tender preparation. The third dilemma that we had to face, not only in the initial but also in the final phase, is when to conclude our work, when to finish monitoring. Our initial timeline seemed to be not controversial. We thought that the monitoring should end once the acceptance procedure is completed. However, the acceptance certificate was not acknowledged by all the parties. A serious dispute ensued between the contracting authority and the contractor. The social observer was also a part here, so we should ask ourselves the question, when should we finish? Perhaps monitoring should also be extended to the warranty period. That's an open question, a food for thought. Wasn't the investment that we monitored too large for the Integrity Pact? That's also an interesting question. We enjoyed significant support from the European Commission, but yes, sometimes it was hard for us to catch up with the pace with which certain events would occur. The value of the investment was almost $500 million Polish zloty. There was a plethora of documentation, correspondence. It was multifaceted in nature. And the question arises, are such investments good for monitoring? I hope that our panelists will be able to cover that. Should we pursue interfering monitoring? That's a good question, but no good answer. My previous slide showed to you that we were kind of interfering observer. We were a bit of an advisor for the parties to the pact. We were not an arbiter, but we were presenting our opinions on a problem. Some people would rather have an observer who is more reserved, rather a rapporteur who is not directly engaging in ongoing problems. I think that's an open issue. How should the observer behave? Another problematic issue is the ability of the Pact to detect corruption and other abuse forms. In our case, there was no corruption. And does it mean that the Pact is not good for such activities, or perhaps there was simply no corruption, or perhaps something else is at stake? We also identified some systemic changes that are needed. We monitored a single investment, but our conclusions may point to certain problems which are more general in nature. For instance, valorization, that was an issue in our contract. We had cases of circumventing construction law. We heard from the market that these were not individual cases that we observed. On the basis of this single case, certain generalizations could be made. We could actually speak of some recommendations related to changing public procurement policies. And last but not least,
I ostatnia rzecz, myślę, że fundamentalna, może nie jeśli chodzi o to.
A matter that is fundamental for future integrity pacts is the source of financing. We know that this was a kind of experimental project. We had significant funding from the European Commission. How will that be solved in the future? Well, that's an open question as well. Let's not forget that financing of integrity pact has to ensure certain independence of social observers. The issue of funding shouldn't link the observer either to the contracting authority or to the contractor. This will allow the observer to be impartial. That's it for me. Let me now hand over to Grzegorz Makowski, who will be the moderator of today's panel. He will introduce the participants of the panel to you. Thank you.
Dziękuję Marcinie i witam wszystkich nas oglądających.
Thank you,
tych, którzy
Marcin.
nas pewnie obejrzą.
Let me welcome
w formie nagrania.
everyone who is watching us live and those of us who will be watching the recording at the very beginning. Let me apologize. I saw some criticism in the chat window stating that we did not ensure gender parity. Well, our efforts were futile. We had some potential female candidates that we hoped for, but the persons in question were not able to attend our panel today. Tomorrow we will ensure better balance. Today, unfortunately, it's men only. I would, however, like to mention Jolanta Pawluk from PKP, the Polish Railroad Company. She has been with us from the very beginning of the Pact. She's not present with us today, but she was definitely an important player, especially on the side of the contracting authority. And now, without further ado, who is with us? I'll be the moderator, and let me present the panelists in alphabetical order. Arnold Bresch, member of the management board of PKP PLK S.A. Wiesław Nowak, president of the management board of ZUE S.A. Marcin Szymański, deputy director in the Ministry of Funds and Regional Policy, in the Department of Infrastructural Programs. Let me just mention that Mr. Szymański was the person who made it all possible. From the very beginning, he was a patron of our pilot project. And we will also have Marcin Waszak with us as a panelist. I would also like to encourage all of you who are watching us on YouTube, on Facebook, to ask questions. If there are any other forms of getting to us with your questions, please do so. And let me refer to the title of the conference. I want to ask a shocking question. If I now kindly ask you to do the following, if I could ask the panelists in alphabetical order to answer the following question. 6 years of the Pact went by. We were trying to assess what was happening on various stages. Now it's the last mile. We know better what it could look like in practice. And my first question is about your assessment. You were engaged in the Pact. We were an observer, an animator of the Pact of sorts, not only in Poland but also in the international arena. You will learn more about our evaluation in the report soon to be published. Today, however, I would like to hear from you, and please try to focus on two aspects. Generally, as to the idea of the Pact, but also in more detail, what did the Pact look like in our case? What went well, what went wrong? How did the Pact impact the implementation of the public procurement project? That would be my first ask to the panelists. And my kind request is, please keep it to 7 minutes. If there is a significant overrun, I will intervene as the moderator. Now over to you, Mr. Bresch. Good morning. Let me welcome everyone very cordially. Indeed, the pandemic disrupted our ability to meet in person, which also impacts the efficiency of our work. Also, the team that was working under the Integrity Pact. At the very beginning, let me tell you that our company pursues a number of different projects, and wherever we work, we try to be transparent, as if Integrity Pact applied to every public procurement order that we're implementing. Most of the work that we do is multifaceted. It's got many aspects that are verified and scrutinized not only by the people who are directly responsible for a specific investment. Our company is indeed big, and it includes departments and units that can interfere with the investment project, draw conclusions, and act. So the fact that we had an arbiter, an organization looking at what was happening from the outside, was not too much complicating. Perhaps it determined the perception of our relationship with the contracting authority and with the construction engineer. When it comes to our general assessment of the 6-year period, we don't have a message that is overtly positive, but we didn't have any negative experiences either. As was rightly pointed out in the introduction, the very formula of having an observer who is not rooted to take decisions, who is not giving green light for certain solutions, but is only a reviewer. Very often the review is made post factum, after a problem occurred, and I dare say that we did have some problems to struggle with. So my first general reflection is lack of responsibility of people implementing the Integrity Pact when it comes to signing specific decisions. Of course, that's a very convenient role, that of a reviewer, but it didn't have any positive impact on the process and on solving problems that we came across. From the very beginning, when you started to participate, you didn't have any right to decide. You, for instance, were part of the tendering committee, but your voice couldn't be heard on the civil works phase. We had some initial information about potential circumvention of construction law. Well, where we disagree with that statement, you didn't have any people who would be authorized to claim anything related to the construction law. You were just observers, and the decisions related to the actual actions undertaken were taken by people who were duly authorized to do so. You were looking at qualification of expenses and the manner of implementing works under two procedures, that of a notification and that of a construction project.
Decyzjami wynikającymi z prawa budowlanego powodowały nie do końca spójne z naszym spojrzeniem
the fact that you did not have any right to take decisions under the umbrella of construction law led to some unclarity when it comes to completion of the process. We kept addressing the contractor for a certificate of handover after completion of all the construction work. In our opinion, that would be a violation of law. The document that was created was aimed at solving the situation of the contractor. We had to withdraw from the contract with the engineer. We ensured investment supervision with our own in-house resources. There was a plethora of problems, I must say. based on notifications from the contractor to the foundation. Reimbursement of expenditure was suspended. This has a heavy impact on the assessment of our cooperation. We didn't obey the procedures related to additional contract. This was observed only at the highest managerial level of our company. However, it was not spotted when the decisions were taken. You all who were there, who were monitoring the contracts, you were able to react more quickly. However, the matter escalated only when we realized that the contractor claimed more money for the works than what is assumed in the cost estimates. The history of how the dispute was solved showed that we were right. The part of the order implemented outside of the contract was done at much lower prices than what was assumed for the main contract by the contractor and the project team. Of course, our experience in recent years also resulted in some structural changes in our company. We have stronger control mechanisms. Wrong decisions that were taken on the level of the project, and consequently there were some personal changes. Some matters were reported to law enforcement bodies. Therefore, we cannot actually refer well to the matter that you highlighted. Let's see how this will be solved by people who are authorized to do so. That's everything from me. I hope that my intervention won't be viewed too negatively. We enjoyed a fresh look of an outsider. Thanks to the months, thanks to your presence during the hardest period when we really had to struggle with difficult problems, we were able to see what it looked like from the outside, from an outsider's perspective. Your presence in the presentation of the project to the community also highlighted certain gaps on our side when it comes to communicating what we do to the stakeholders, people in individual localities. We draw our conclusions, we have our lessons learned, and this is particularly that area where we see that the Pact had its most positive impact. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for being so disciplined. Can I just have one tiny comment? As a party to the Pact, we don't have an overtly positive view of the tool either. However, we are an organization that promotes participation. Therefore, the very idea is close to us, but we do see that the tool has its pros and cons. However, this was just a pilot project. If it's to be implemented at large in practice, there's a fair chance that it will be improved. And now, without further ado, let me hand over to Mr. Nowak, President of the Management Board of ZUE S.A. The question is the same. Good morning to all of us. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome everyone who is watching us and listening to us. I'll try to briefly summarize our share, our participation, and our evaluation of the Integrity Pact. Let me start by saying that the Integrity Pact was implemented As a pilot program, the investment was a railroad line stretch between Zawiercie and Częstochowa. At the beginning, not everybody knew what the Integrity Pact was, what its role was, what the representatives of the Pact were authorized to, and what the end effect should be. The practicalities were worked out when the pact was implemented, and like you heard, there was a lot of evolution. In our opinion, all parties had their input to the pact, which should be viewed as a positive thing. It was a pilot program, and therefore it's important to draw conclusions and lessons learned for the future. Not only when it comes to achievements and success of the program, but it should also look at things that could have gone better, and there were such things. Let me start with positive aspects, because in my opinion they are more numerous. The fact that our company was part of the Integrity Pact is something that I view as a positive thing. I'm satisfied that we had a chance to take part in that project. From the point of view of ZUE as a contractor of a public procurement project, I would like to draw your attention to a couple of aspects that were positive in nature of the program. First of all, for us, that was great inspiration and assistance in developing and implementing a new policy of ethical governance and management in our company. And my big thank you goes to the foundation. Your input, your comments were really very helpful for us. Second of all, the observer would encourage not only the contracting authority but also the contractor to amicably settle disputes related to the contract. To the best of the observer's knowledge, the observer would suggest formulas for conciliatory solutions. Importantly, the observer was also trying to draw the parties' attention to the interest of local communities, the needs of local communities. To the best of its mandate, the social observer was always trying to find conciliatory solutions and would also try to encourage us to include the aspect of the interest of local communities into consideration without only focusing on technical aspects. I think that these would be the three relevant positive aspects. Let me mention another one, perhaps not directly related to the contract implementation. In my opinion, however, it's equally important. You represented project participants really well during international meetings devoted to the Integrity Pact. That is commendable. What went south? What went wrong? In the eyes of the contractor, what was missing was the management of conflict of interest by the social observer. On the day of signing the contract, you drew our attention to potential conflict of interest among the contractor's key personnel members. We thought that there was no conflict of interest. However, on that day, it was also repeated by the contracting authority. However, we concluded that your perspective, the outsider's perspective, can be different. We changed the person. I think it was a correct thing to do. We eliminated the source of potential conflict of interest, and you appreciated that. A similar problem materialized when it came to the observers' opinions on validity of the so-called handover certificate. This was a topic that was indeed a contentious issue, but let's leave it to an independent court. However, we can draw some conclusions for the future. First of all, the story showed to us the fundamental role of impartiality of social observer in integrity pacts. Social observer doesn't have any competences reserved under the Integrity Pact, giving any mandate to impact the parties to the project. For the observer to operate effectively, he or she has to have authority, which is rooted in the fact that the parties are sure about the observer's impartiality. Subsequent monitoring of the investment was dependent on the decision related to the validity of the certificate, and the matter is complicated then because a conflict of interest occurred. Similarly, when there was a dispute related to the conflict of interest, in our opinion, the observer didn't have the right toolkit, transparent procedures that would allow the observer to manage the situation properly. That's why I think it's vital for future social observers to be obliged to prepare and publish dedicated internal procedures of preventing conflict of interest and managing cases of conflict of interest should they materialize. Such procedures should make it possible for social observers to transparently operate with all parties to the investment process, should allow risk management related to conflict of interest. And if I were to answer your question, what was the most beneficial aspect? Well, in my view, the observer was always giving the parties a chance to solve the disputes in a conciliatory manner for the sake of the investment and also for the sake of local communities. The observers' capabilities, because of restricted mandate, were not high. However, the engagement brought some positive fruit that is very visible. In my view, it's really worth developing for the future. The Integrity Pact forces the parties to the investment project to be more transparent, open. Investment participants are obliged to inform each other about what they do, justify their actions in a public manner. Thanks to the Pact, transparency of investments carried out from public funds is increased. In a democratic state, it is desirable. And that will be it when it comes to my general observation. I think I will have a chance to exchange our views later on. And indeed,
ani to miejsce, ani to forum, na którym powinniśmy o tym rozmawiać, w związku z tym pozostawię to bez komentarza.
My four-speaker mentioned Poraj. Well, it's easy to evaluate it from your perspective, but it's not the forum to talk about it in detail, so I shall not comment that. Thank you. Thank you very much, and I would also like to thank you for being spot on in terms of time. You're a railroad person, aren't you? And a small comment from me, it's good that you emphasized the fact that indeed this project could be called Learning by doing,
przeszedł
we're
od
entering
razu
an
do
uncharted
pana dyrektora
territory, and in
Szymańskiego,
fact, if we are to
dokładnie
have
z
more
samym
integrity
takim
pacts,
diagnostycznym pytaniem,
then our good and
oddaję
bad
głos tutaj, a myślę, że po
conclusions
naszej
will
rundzie,
definitely
jeżeli tutaj w
be
międzyczasie się
useful.
nie pojawią
And now,
głosy
without
z
further
zewnątrz,
ado,
to
I would
bym
like to
zrobił
hand over
taką,
to Mr. Szymański, and
przerwę
the
między
question is
kolejnym
exactly
pytaniem
the
i
same. Over to
ewentualnie bym
you.
poprosił o odniesienie się państwa
I
między
think
sobą.
that after our
Pani
first
dyrektor.
round, we will answer the questions from our listeners, and if there are no questions, I will ask you to interact with each other. Sir, over to you. Hello. I would like to welcome everybody who is observing that debate. I will give you the perspective of the managing authority managing the Infrastructure and Environment Operating Program. For us, participation in that pilot project related to the Integrity Pact was very interesting. No regrets at all. As my four speakers mentioned, we also were not sure what it would look like in practice. We didn't know what to expect. When we applied for one of our projects to be included in the Integrity Pact, our main goal was to test whether this solution could help us combating misappropriation, tender collusions in particular. This was our conclusion drawn in the previous financial perspective, 2007-2013. We had cases of collusions in road investments. We had to suspend payments, and steps had to be taken to facilitate the operation of the system in that particular respect. In 2014, all managing authorities were obliged to implement effective and proportionate manners to combat financial abuse and misappropriation. Back then, we took a number of initiatives in this respect aimed at creating an effective system that will ensure that money spent under EU funds is spent in a correct and effective manner. Looking at the idea of the Integrity Pact, it seemed to us that this may be the key to creating an effective system for preventing financial abuse and misappropriation. Initially, we submitted 2 projects of ours to be included in the Pact. This was a road project under the General Directorate of Roads and Railroad of Motorways, and a railroad project. Finally, it was decided that only one of the projects will be included in the Integrity Pact. Well, I regret, perhaps we would have more conclusions today if we had those 2 projects. Now let me move on to the assessment. Well, you can't be either negative or positive. It's not a binary thing, black or white thing. I would like to look at it from the perspective of the objectives of the project, the expectations of the European Commission. I think that the goal was, first of all, to ensure that this tool prevents corruption, increases transparency in public procurement. It was to generate savings, increase competitiveness, and facilitate the implementation of projects. And thirdly, the participation component is not less important. The Pact should be a tool to increase engagement of local communities in the process of spending public money, and hence build trust in public bodies. For that prism, I can say that the goals were not fully attained. In terms of the first item, let me refer back to the initial concept. The Pact was aimed at being a tool to combat abuse in countries where corruption is almost systemic. That's something that Transparency International would say, and it's hard to say that in Poland this is so bad. I think that when it comes to EU funds, we have stable control and scrutiny mechanisms. For some time now, actually, we haven't had any problem of related to financial abuse, corruption, misappropriation. It's non-existent. Still, however, I think that the pact is a costly tool. Among the NGOs, there is no potential to engage in monitoring so much as the Batory Foundation did. That increases the effectiveness of the pact and its ability to be used on a mass scale. Moreover, this tool is not effective for all potential forms of abuse, for instance, tender collusions, division of the market. In the case of one tender only, it's hard to determine risks which are more general in nature, which apply to the entire market. I would agree, therefore, with the thesis presented in the report. The Pact is an anti-corruption tool that works well in countries with a low anti-corruption culture, where there is no strong mechanisms preventing irregularities. When it comes to the impact of the Pact on the cost of projects, it seems to me that there was not much difference versus the standard versus other tenders of PKP. It didn't make the project more complicated, even though there were more obligations on the contracting authority and the contractor related, for instance, to the compliance. And as for the element of participation here, in this respect, I think that despite the efforts of the foundation, despite its many meetings, it was not possible to engage local community in the investment or the pact itself. I think that nevertheless it's worth doing it. And my personal reflection that I'd like to share with you, the fact that the project was included in the pact, that there was a pact, could impact the efficiency of the investment. The observer always impacts the observed object. This is a clear thing in psychology, sociology. Perhaps the observer had some impact on the operations of the contractor and the contracting authority. So let me put the following thesis forward. Perhaps that reduced elasticity, flexibility made the parties to the project more rigid. And as a result, certain facts were escalated, which could lead to extension of the time for project implementation. Using railroad language, perhaps without the pact there wouldn't be such a delay. That's something that we should bear in mind. Significant level of engagement of the observer, engagement of the parties, clarification of questions may cause delays in project implementation. However, I also see a number of benefits related to the Pact. First of all, what was improved was the awareness level when it comes to anti-abuse and anti-corruption procedures. This was visible, for instance, in the whistleblowing mechanism that was implemented. That's a big thank you to the contractor who suggested a change not only for that specific project, but also adopted it as a change in its organization and also among its subcontractors. Another positive thing is this huge engagement of the foundation. You were not just a passive observer, you got engaged in all the works. You were trying to investigate and clarify everything to make sure that the entire undertaking went as smooth as possible. As we heard at the beginning from the foundation's representative, you also carried out a number of informational and educational activities. You set up a website with interesting information that could be used. That will definitely be helpful for tender market participants. You organized meetings, workshops, created podcasts that can also be used. You created a sort of catalogue of good practices also. It seems to me that the Pact can contribute to strengthening and enhancing the potential of NGOs and as CSOs. That's a chance for them to gain valuable experience when it comes to public procurement investments. The foundation itself, at the beginning of the Pact, was not fully aware of the workload that was ahead of it. It's not the greatest project on the scale. I would say it's a mid-sized project indeed, so the Pact can enhance the potential, knowledge and know-how of NGOs and CSOs. For me, the key benefit was focusing on specifically these aspects, systemic problems that occurred in that investment, but that are also were a commonplace on the public procurement market a couple of years back. For instance, valorization of the price of the contract, or out-of-court settlements, accountability, access to public information, company secret. Indeed, very interesting debates and discussions were organized to shed more light and to give us more useful information. For us, participation in the Pact also meant that we took the decision to work on the provincial level with construction authorities. These are the authorities that issue zoning decisions, construction permits and other permits for investments of constructional nature that are financed from the funds that we manage. And we hope that this will facilitate the process. In a nutshell, it seems to me that the Pact is a very interesting tool. It should be used and it should be continued. Perhaps it's not an effective tool when it comes to preventing corruption. Of course, I should mention that the very fact that the project has an Integrity Pact is preventive in nature. I think the risk of conflict of interest in our specific project was addressed correctly. This tool can also raise the awareness, enhance the culture of integrity, and it can bring about interesting systemic recommendations for the decision makers on the public procurement market. Thank you very much. Well, I think you've exceeded your time slot a bit. It was not in our interest. I gave you more time when you were talking about positive aspects. Not intended, however. Before I hand over to Marcin, because I'm sure that he will be willing to comment your interventions, I would suggest that I shorten Marcin's time. We also have one question. I will read it to you after Marcin's intervention. And a small side remark from me when it comes to participation and mobilization. I'll speak on behalf of the entire team and say that, yes, we didn't achieve what we wanted. Also, when it comes to selection of the investment for monitoring, there was only one investment and only one foundation that was interested in being the observer. If we had the Italian story, several organizations wanting to be an observer, perhaps there would be more projects monitored. However, at every single step, the mobilization was not what we would expect it to be. Yet, on the last mile, the last meeting in Poraj was really interesting. For me personally, that was a refreshing signal. I realized that we have to invest much more in communication. Suddenly, it turned out that it's possible to spike interest among local communities that are affected by investments. People who notice very local problems. And that's why tomorrow we will focus on mobilizing local communities. We will have the mayor of Poraj with us. Perhaps that will be a chance to draw some lessons learned for the future. Marcin, I give you 5 minutes. Can you refer to the words of your 4 speakers, and then I will read the question from the observers of our conversation and ask you to perhaps interact with each other, share your comments. Thank you. Yes, I'll try to be brief. It's much more important what our partners have to say, but I would like to acknowledge the fact that after almost 5 years, none of the parties wanted to withdraw from the pact. They were not looking for a pretext to do so. They didn't want to get rid of the obligations that were imposed on them by the pact. Quite on the contrary, I would say that everyone, in my view, were acting in good faith. And let me just remind you that there were no sanctions in the pact foreseen for non-obeyance of the obligations. When times were hard, we could only ask, remind people, but we wouldn't threaten them. There were no tools for us to do so. That was, however, not necessary at all. Rather than that, I noticed that despite all the disputes between us and the contractor, us and the contracting authority, you heard that sometimes we had divergent opinions. I would agree with one of the 4 speakers. There's no point getting into detail of it. We will have all the details in the monitoring report. We will present the perspective of the contractor and the contracting authority, so everybody will have a chance to develop their take on the project. Despite all the crises, the project survived, the pact survived. There were some deep disputes, but we were always able to solve them in a conciliatory manner. We went apart feeling that, okay, our opinions differ, but we want to be a part of that still. I think this is a positive sign. If you look at other European countries, often the pact didn't get to the stage where we are right now. The investment is almost complete, and we endured throughout the entire period we were present. So this is my big thank you to our guests. I'm glad that we all took part in it until the end, and that we did it in good faith. Yes, there were some critical opinions. I agree with some of them. Based on our experience, I think it is hard to say that the Integrity Pact is an anti-corruption tool. That's something that the Commission would like to see here. Problems that we were struggling with were rather irregularities. That's how the European regulation phrases it. These were unintended actions that caused perturbations. But these were not intended actions aimed at personal gain that could be categorized as corruption. Our challenges were rather cases of ill management of projects and not necessarily crimes or criminal offenses. The question arises, is the Pact really a tool to detect hard corruptions? On the basis of our pilot project, we can say that we find no evidence to support that thesis. In some cases, we could have reacted earlier. As you heard, there was the story with the underground passage in Poraj. The works had been started but were not completed for various reasons. Certain procedures were not obeyed. We kept asking about that for a longer period of time. We were trying to look at it, to observe it. We didn't get all information on time. We were not able to participate in all meetings that we wanted to be a part of. Perhaps quicker reaction from the observer would allow certain problems not to exacerbate. However, we have to clearly state one thing. On the one hand, we didn't have all the data, and very often we would learn about things after they already occurred. While carrying out monitoring activities, should we really be less interfering? That's what was suggested. Should the observer be less interfering? Should this approach be able to prevent such situations like the one in Poraj? We were an active observer. That was our decision. We took some responsibility for actions that were carried out as part of the contract. We could have remained silent, just take our notes and present them at the end. Marcin, your final reflection? Still, we were trying to get engaged. We were trying to voice our doubts. However, we always tried to professionally present arguments of our thesis. We were not downplaying anything. Thank you. Thank you. Before I ask the next two questions that I actually sent to our guests beforehand when inviting the panelists, I will look at what's happening in our social media. Now we are entering the second round, and I would like to ask the panelists first. Would you like to comment on your interventions among your group? I would give you 2 minutes for reflections and counter-reflections. Well, before I hand over the microphone to you, would the other participants also be willing to comment? No, not for the time being. Mr. Nowak? Well, that will most likely depend on what I say, whether others will be willing to speak as well. I wanted to give you a brief summary. Some of the people who are listening to us don't know the details. They might be thinking that we are talking about some burning conflict that prevents the contract to be fully executed. Well, the big news is, indeed, we had a serious problem to solve, but we solved it in an amicable manner, and a settlement was concluded between the companies to settle the works done by ZUE. The end is good. It's a happy ending. The passage that we are constructing additionally in Poraj will serve the local inhabitants and travelers. It will be operational this year, and our experience shows us how to ensure transparency of granting additional contracts. The root of the problem was the scope of works that was defined once the contract was signed. Once we've completed the procedure of determining the scope of agreement, once the feasibility study was done, when we had the documentation for the basic scope, suddenly it turned out that there are new needs, new requirements, and we've drawn our conclusions from that. That's something that I wanted to clarify. The dispute was solved in a positive manner. The works were settled already. The only negative aspect is that it took us longer than foreseen, and perhaps a quicker reaction of the observer here would allow us to be on time in Poraj. That's something that I wanted to voice. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Nowak, do you want to take the floor? You have 2 minutes. Well, I also wanted to underscore that despite these 2 disputes that were mentioned by my speaker and myself, since December last year, this line is fully operational. It has been used by PKP PLK and other operators. It is safe. It meets all the standards and requirements. However, when it comes to the underground passage in Poraj, it is our sincere hope and deep belief that it will be opened soon, and that soon the problem of Poraj will be solved.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja dosłownie słówko dodam, oczywiście nie przypisuję temu paktowi, aczkolwiek
Thank you very much.
staraliśmy się wzbudzać dyskusję
I'll just
na temat
add
alternatywnych sposobów rozwiązywania sporów pozasądowych.
my short comment.
Chyba nawet dwukrotnie teraz
We were trying to draw the participants' attention to forms of out-of-court settlement. I think we contacted Minister Hałady, head of the Office of the General Counsel of the Republic of Poland, and perhaps that was our tiny role to play. Mediation is becoming more and more popular. It's more popular than it was 5 or 6 years ago. The new public procurement law also added a formula for that. Well, my second question will refer to the title of today's meeting. What's the future of Integrity Pacts in your view? We experienced a certain formula of the Pact, and do you think that some modifications is needed? Well, we all agree that it's not a mass usage tool, also because of the cost of it. Perhaps, however, it might come in handy, and please give us arguments of your view. And another question, if we continue working with Pacts, should we give it some legal shape? This refers to the question of Paweł Kaczkan, who was part of the Pact. Paweł is asking whether the contract, whether the Pact that we concluded, the formula of the Pact, in other words, a contract and some elements included in the contract with the contractor and the project engineer, was that enough? Well, we have our answer to that. And I would kindly like to ask the panelists to give their views on the following questions. In a nutshell, future perspectives. Should we change the formula? Should we regulate it in the law? Or is a civil law contract enough? If not, why? If yes, why? And a third topic that I would like to add, if you say no to Pacts, should we create any space whatsoever for the presence of citizens under other formulas? in the broadly understood sphere of public procurement. Indeed, public procurement is about making public decisions about public money. This is an area where we should be present. There are billions of public money that are allocated through public procurement. Is there a need to do some monitoring? These don't have to be CSOs, these could be higher education institutions, some expert groups. Let's look at large infrastructural projects like the one that we monitored, and perhaps a review, a close-up review would be good from time to time. Perhaps sometimes individual cases would allow us to draw some conclusions, but we should have a formula at hand, methodology of how to proceed, and then from time to time would be able to implement it. I hope that as a moderator of this discussion I didn't create too much of a commotion. And now let me hand over to Mr. Szymański. We will go in reverse alphabetical order now. Over to you. And Marcin, you will be the last one to speak.
Thank you very much for your question.
Based on our experiences and realizing that there are some benefits from the project, we are very much in favor of continuing that initiative. One case is not representative enough. Perhaps we can draw some conclusions from what happened and simply improve subsequent pacts. I think that was the expectation of the contractors. One of them came back to us, came back to the foundation to check whether it would be possible to have Integrity Pact on one of other investments that they were pursuing. Back then that was not possible. However, I think contractors may be interested in that. Some time ago, as part of our program, we carried out a survey among beneficiaries. We asked about the efficacy of our mechanisms, and we also asked a question about whether beneficiaries would be interested in participating in such undertakings. 40% of people knew the idea of the pact, so we are not yet there, and 30% of our respondents, i.e. over 100 beneficiaries, were very encouraged with the possibility to participate in such an initiative. Majority of our respondents saw benefits, potential benefits of participating in it. So a potential continuation formula would be to have what we had before. The Commission is financing the pact, selecting the observer, because that ensures full impartiality of the observer and independence on the contractor and on the contracting authority. If we were to finance it as the managing authority and we were to select the observer, then we would have to use national funds for the pact. In other words, we would have to use the same budget that is used for public investments, and that might cause some concerns, especially among the contractors, whether observers are fully objective and impartial. I don't have much experience when it comes to selecting observers. In the case of NGOs, we cannot apply public procurement law. Rather than that, we should follow the principles of the Act on Volunteering and public benefit organizations, and I think these would be the framework of our guidelines for selecting organizations to do the Integrity Pact under the new financial perspective. We would very much like the Pact to be present from the earliest stage of investment. The problem in our particular project was that the observer intervened too late, when there was no room for optimization of the manner of pursuing the works, the scope of works. Perhaps that could have reduced the cost or ensured better spending for public money. I'm sure this is going to be our main objective. if pacts were to be implemented in the current formula, we would have to be aware of the fact that there won't be that many pacts, 2, 3 perhaps. I'm sure we will not have more capacity to handle a pact on our side. When it comes to regulating the pact in the legal system, I think that would be very helpful. First of all, it would increase the awareness level of the role of observer. It would be definitely helpful when it comes to the selection of the observer, but I have my doubts whether it is necessary for the time being. First of all, we managed to implement the pact, even though there is absolutely no legal regulation whatsoever in that respect. It was a modular construction of sorts, a pact between the observer and the contracting authority, and integrating certain elements of the pact in the contract between the contractor and the contracting authority. Perhaps that's the solution for the future. Perhaps we should have these elements of the pact in the contract between the contractor and the contracting authority. Perhaps we should have provisions related to compliance, transparency, prevention of misuse of funds, openness, etc. Furthermore, it seems to me that the pact should be a voluntary tool, facultative in nature. I think it shouldn't, therefore, be part of the legal framework unless we come to the conclusion that it should be used in big strategic undertakings. In the past, we would have the anti-corruption shield that provided for monitoring in projects of vital importance for the state. Perhaps that might be an answer. However, we all agreed that it cannot be applied commonly because it doesn't have the right potential yet. NGOs don't have the right potential yet. Therefore, if we were to include in our legal framework a special mechanism that would only apply to a fraction of investment projects, might not be the best idea. And let me echo the words that have already been uttered. The current situation is different than what it was 5 years ago. We have the new public procurement law that solves a number of problems. It motivates people to mediate, to settle out of court, prevents abuse of power. It should foster the process of planning and determining the contracting authority's needs and the way to satisfy these needs. The scope of activities is much greater. The contracting authority is obliged to publicly announce information about the tender and to create a report specifying the reasons and details of a situation when the tender or the procedure was not successful. That should be food for thought and some material to draw conclusions. So perhaps we should wait a while and see what the evaluation of all the new regulations and solutions will be. If we were not to regulate it in the law, then it would be good to either have an obligation on the contracting authority to include specific provisions in the contracts with contractors. That's what we did in the pilot project. For certain, we should also strengthen the aspect of access to information about investments carried out. We should make as much information, documents and data available on the websites of public investors so that every citizen has access to it and is up to speed when it comes to progress of specific investments. This data should be transparent, legible, understandable for your average Pole, and it should also be possible to compare them. When it comes to transparency, the new Anti-Corruption Act is worth mentioning. it is necessary right now to publish information about concluded contracts. If the value of the contract is higher than 500 zloty, the contracting authority has to publish information about such orders. This threshold is very low. Up until recently, there were many contracts of so-called insignificant value that did not have to be reported, which created a kind of gray zone. I think that we also have to tap into the potential of advanced data analysis methods. For instance, the risk barometer or a portal tender score that was created recently. It presents warning signals related to public tenders, risks that might materialize, also of corruptive nature. There are many databases, plethora of data online. The point is to collect it, analyze it, preferably in an automated manner using some IT tools. The main goal of the European Commission in its latest strategy related to financial abuse is to ensure the right quality of data and proper analysis. I myself have high hopes related to that when it comes to whistleblowers. The new directive was recently published. We are all waiting for the national legal acts to transpose the directive. I hope this will be something that will change the playing field. We will have proper protection for whistleblowers, and we will be able to handle and process anonymous notifications. I think this tool will help us to effectively combat all kinds of abuse, also in the field of public procurement. Thank you very much. Right now, let me add one question to all panelists. Also to you, sir. Knowing everything that you know today, would you enter a pact once again? Yes. Yes, like I said at the beginning, absolutely. One case is not enough to draw conclusions. We want to repeat it, and we are determined to do so. And that will be our position that we will present to the European Commission. Thank you very much. This set of questions goes to our other panelists. Over to you, sir. Well, I think I've already answered your question. Yes, if there was another contract with an integrity pact, we would go for it. We wouldn't have anything against it. And to answer your previous questions, I am echoing the words of my fellow colleague, Mr. Szymański. Integrity pacts could work out in the field of public procurement. As I already said, they increase transparency of investments implemented from public funds. In my view, corruption is not a problem that is significantly threatening public procurement in Poland. It would be good to develop the observer's activity aspect that the Batory Foundation engaged in under the current project. What do I mean? The observer being a mediator, a conciliatory entity in the process of mediation. Also being the minder of justified interest of justified interest of local communities, and drawing the attention of the parties to the contract to local communities. If we go along the same, if we are to go along the same line, it would be necessary to regulate the Integrity Pact in the EU directive related to public procurement. Perhaps it should be obligatory to have integrity pacts in the greatest, in terms of size and value, projects. There could be some value threshold. But I think that integrity pacts should also be present in those projects that are of particular importance for citizens. Other projects might have an integrity pact on a voluntary basis. I can't think of a need or the obligation to have integrity pacts in all public procurement projects from different contracting authorities. I can't think of it. It would be impossible in Poland, simply for the lack of proper preparation to pursue such an undertaking. What should be present in the EU law, in the EU directives? They should regulate the rights and duties and the competences of the observer, so that it is guaranteed that the observer is impartial and fully independent on the parties to the contract, both the contractor and the contracting authority. They should also guarantee equal position of both parties to the contract. Like my colleagues, I think that it's important to guarantee that the observer is present from the moment the tender specification is drafted down to the last element of the contract completion. The observer shouldn't be engaged only on the stage of tendering. The way tender will be carried out is determined when the specification is created, and I think it is from that moment that the social observer should participate in the project. You ask the question about potential continuation of the pacts. Should they be financed directly from the EU funds and not any institutions that are related to the contracting authority? That was a suggestion made. I'm not going to refer to that specific contract, but present my general conclusion, general suggestion. Perhaps in tying the observer to the institutions that might in any way represent the contracting authority might impede the impartiality of observers, and might in the end run lead to the observer being a servant of the contracting authority, and that would be the absolute opposite of the role that the observer should play. A social observer is supposed to be really well prepared to play his or her role. That's why the selection criteria should be based on quality and not on price. Otherwise, we will quickly substitute CSOs with some cheap players. Will have a market of social observers, and their actions will only be governed by financial aspects. To sum up, we have a positive approach to continuation of integrity pacts. However, when it comes to other forms of supervision and scrutiny over public procurement, based on our many years of experience, we conclude that the best instrument for social control over tenders is possibly broad access of citizens to public information. As long as the contracting authority does not restrict this access, as long as it's not restricted by any other organizations or bodies, this is the best criterion, and personally, I don't see any need for more tools to be created in this respect. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. And
ostatni.
Starałem się zanotować
Last but not least,
kilka kwestii, które
I
wynikały
was
z pytania i
trying
też
to
przy
jot down a
wypowiedziach.
couple of points that I
Wydaje mi
wanted
się,
to
że
raise to answer your question.
przynajmniej z dyrektorem Szymańskim i z prezesem Nowakiem to mamy tą samą ocenę sytuacji.
When it comes to
I
Mr.
tak samo
Szymański
reagujemy
and
na
Mr.
pytanie,
Nowak,
które
we
padło, bo
have
to
exactly the
pytanie było
same
takie
take on the situation,
z
and
podtekstem.
we react
Oczywiście
in exactly the
te
same way to
kwestie,
your question.
pytanie, które z
There
zewnątrz
was a second
dostaliśmy,
bottom in it.
to rzeczywiście my też nie chcielibyśmy uniknąć wiedzy
I mean the
o
question
problemach,
from
które zostały
the
stwierdzone,
audience.
także na pewno ocena
We
faktu
don't want
nie
to
wynika z faktów, które
refuse to
stwierdziliśmy,
accept knowledge about the
realizując,
problems.
tą konkretnie umowę. I teraz takie główne wątki, które sobie
Our
zanotowałem,
evaluation
to
of
chyba
the
wspólnie
idea
dochodzimy do
is not
wniosku,
solely
że
based on what
tego
happened.
typu instrumenty
My
powinny być wprowadzane na innym etapie realizacji
opinion is that there is a joint
zadań
conclusion.
inwestycyjnych,
Such instruments
generalnie
should be
na etapie
implemented at a
przygotowania
different
i
stage
myślę,
of the investment
oczywiście
process,
etap przetargu
generally
to są te
already at the
miejsca, gdzie można
preparation stage.
byłoby wyłapywać
I think the
potencjalne
tendering
nieprawidłowości.
phase is the
Doświadczenie
phase where we
tych
could
ostatnich kilku lat
spot
pokazuje,
potential
że
irregularities.
Pakt nie sprawdził się
The experience
w
from
rozwiązywaniu sporów
recent
tak
years
czysto
shows us that the Pact did
realizacyjno-budowlanych.
not work
I to
well
też
when it comes to
nie dziwimy się,
solving
bo tam wymagana jest wiedza
operational
ekspercka,
disputes,
z branży
disputes very
budowlanej. I tu
practical
bym
in
chciał
nature, and
powiedzieć,
no
że my
wonder
jako
expert knowledge from the
branża
construction
budowlana
field is needed for that.
prowadzimy dialog. Może to jest też miejsce, żeby kilka
We,
słów
as
powiedzieć,
the
że
construction sector,
my zmieniliśmy w ostatnich latach
are in dialogue.
umowę bazową.
Perhaps that would be the right occasion to say that in recent years we changed our base agreement.
Też duża rola
This is an agreement that is the basis for announcing and signing tender documents. Mr. Nowak has a great role to play here. He represents not only his company but also an association of many companies from that sector. Our experience related to our contracts impact our solutions. We developed a new contract with valorization provisions, with a clause that allows us to make purchases, etc., etc. I'm just trying to highlight that there is a forum where the sector can talk about it. Perhaps CSO should be invited to that forum. Perhaps they should present their opinion there. It would be good to have an outsider evaluate our activities. We can see that it all should start at the stage of preparing tender documentation. Another thing I wanted to comment on is that when we look at the investment process, current problems tend to result from decisions taken years ago. The decisions that we are taking right now will bring their effects in some time. When it comes to engaging local communities in works to determine the scope of an investment, we cannot admit that there will be anybody outside the company who knows more than we do when it comes to construction of a railroad track. However, we often miss the local perspective, and for that we carry out consultation processes. Right now, our consultation processes are really well expanded. We do consultations already on the stage of selecting variants for investment, potential options to use the investment potential in the best way in a given locality. I think that also allows us to avoid problems that occurred in our particular project. You mentioned that the Pact was a gateway to represent problems or potential problems, potential irregularities for people from outside of the group of direct stakeholders. Well, let me refer you to the directive that is currently being transposed to national legal orders, the directive related to whistleblowers. We know that it's the final mile of the administrative work, and we know that there will be a place in the legal system for whistleblowers, for protection of whistleblowers. To sum up, In terms of the future, we as the contracting authority would like to have a clear situation. If there is a legal requirement to have such monitoring tool, Integrity Pact, we will do that. We will meet that obligation. If the institutions that provide financing for projects to us introduce such obligations, we will be doing that. But from our perspective, and bear in mind, most of us are engineers. We want to do our job as soon as possible without any additional workload. And we wouldn't like this to be common practice. Mr. Nowak said that Integrity Pacts should apply to all big investment projects above a certain threshold. Well, my fear is that with the potential that we have in our country, a limited number of people prepared to be knowledgeable enough in terms of finances, in terms of technicalities, might lead to a situation in which we only have experts and there's not enough people to pursue the projects. Perhaps we should facilitate the work of engineers who are required for such contracts. Perhaps we should also enhance the effectiveness of feasibility studies so that the variants are optimum in terms of finances, but also in terms of their social impact. Thank you. Thank you. Before I hand over to Marcin, a small note from me in terms of the last topic that you mentioned, scarcity of engineers. Well, we have felt it very painfully as the observer. We announced our own tender for technical consultants and we only got one application. And when the notion of conflict of interest occurred, we had terrible problems to substitute that particular person. Luckily, we managed a way not to substitute the said person. I see a lack of potential on the side of CSOs, but there is also very small potential of experts. If we take construction projects as an example, expertise is needed. And I was really surprised that in a country as big as ours, the group of people with the right knowledge is so small. Half jokingly, I can say that, well, recently I saw the results of an OECD study on higher education in the individual states, and it turns out that Poland is an absolute leader when it comes to women graduating from technical schools and technical universities. So perhaps that's some beacon of hope. Women will save us not only on a small scale like the Integrity Pacts, but also they will support the implementation of infrastructural projects that require technical and engineering knowledge. Marcin, can I ask you for your final word? Well, if I could interrupt. Well, what you mentioned at the end, scarcity of engineers, that's a topic that was observed as potential conflict of interest by your foundation on the stage of tender procedure. Unfortunately, we are a very consolidated sector. Very often people have been working in the railroad sector for generations, and it's hard to expect that the person will not have anybody ever from his or her relatives working for PKP. We pay attention to potential business conflicts. We avoid a situation in which there are relatives whose business decisions may impact each other's fate, each other business performance. We pay a lot of attention to that, but the root cause of that is insufficient potential on the market. Yes, I take the perspective of a sociologist. I think that in particular in certain areas, conflict of interest is all too natural. It cannot be avoided. The only thing you can do is to manage it well. I think this particular sector might be one of such places. Marcin? So you have 5 or 4 minutes. Well, let me be brief. The balance of the Integrity Pact is positive, no doubt about it. We think that it facilitates the flow of information about the tender. It stimulates positive changes, not only on the level of the interested parties, but also on a more general level, the level of legal solutions that were mentioned before by our guests. In the context of the problems that we were handling under the Pact. This is a tool that we should be implementing in Poland in the future. There are, however, many challenges related to that. We will have to overcome them. The other panelists have already said a lot, and I don't want to repeat the words, but I would like to say a couple of words about our cooperation with consultants, legal consultants, technical consultants. Grzegorz already told you that it was not easy to get them, but also at the stage of contract implementation we had trouble when it comes to accessing such people. These people were not working for us exclusively, they were terribly busy. People with their competences level are usually very busy. That slowed down our activities. Sometimes it prevented us from going forward because we simply didn't have such access to our consultants as we would like to have. Something that is worth serious reflection is the way to increase the availability of expert resources for CSOs that could be observers in the future. Perhaps we might think of a group of experts providing services to entities embarking on integrity pacts. Then it would be easier to find them, to work with them. This aspect had a tremendous impact on how the monitoring was being carried out, and it deserves our attention. Another challenge, even greater in nature, is to find the candidates for social observers. In Poland, I think there are not that many organizations with a profile resembling that of the Batory Foundation. We have extensive experience when it comes to anti-corruption, whistleblowers, conflict of interest. It's all too natural for us. We have a certain legacy in this respect and a certain level of expertise. However, you should also state that in comparison with other NGOs in Poland, our resources are higher than average. Are there any other entities, people who could take up the obligations of a social observer like we did and do it in an effective manner? The question about candidates is an open one. Perhaps we should therefore focus on the smaller tenders, something that could be manageable for our NGOs. Let me draw your attention that you should not only have a match between the organization and the project that should be monitored. You should be matched not only in terms of resources, people, or the area of operation, but also location plays a role. We haven't mentioned that, but the fact that we are based in Warsaw and the investment that we monitored was in the region of Silesia meant that we had to travel a lot. The contact was not always what we would expect it to be, because sometimes we were simply not there on site on everyday basis. We didn't meet the people. We couldn't keep an eye on them, if I may call it that way, and that made our work a bit more difficult as well. I think it would be good to have some regionalization, meaning that organizations that do monitor and a project are located more or less in the same vicinity. And if we realize that there are really few organizations that could be an observer under Integrity Pacts, the aspect of geographical proximity might be another problem. Thank you. Thank you. We only have 2 more minutes. I will not be brave enough to give a broad summary. I will just say that soon we shall publish our report summarizing the Integrity Pact. Everybody will be able to read the report. There will be an executive summary, because the report itself is lengthy, and I must admit that we couldn't keep all the deadlines, but right now we are in the final technical stage, so it will be published soon. As a summary, I can offer the following words. I'm very happy that today we looked not only on the pros but also the cons of Integrity Pact, so we were not trying to sugarcoat anything. We know that the tool might come in handy. We know that there are certain drawbacks. We are aware of our errors and things that should be improved if we were to replicate it in the future. That will be some benchmark for us, some reference point. There are two further items that I would like to mention. Mr. Nowak and Mr. Szymański underscored the role of compliance management and whistleblowers. Thanks to the Pact, ZUE is going to be a leader of sorts, definitely among companies with Polish capital on the private market in this respect. I think that in the context of implementation of the Whistleblowers Directive, which is going to start anytime soon, the experience gathered will definitely come in handy. And I can assure you that I've already recommended some companies to contact you. It seems to me that you will be a good reference point for them. This is a secondary effect of the Integrity Pact. I'm also referring many people to Mr. Szymański. I know that the system for protection of whistleblowers has been in the pipeline for some time now. You will be able to give your perspective, share some good perspectives related to protection of whistleblowers. From the point of view of the ministry, I was really interested in the survey that you mentioned. What I would like to emphasize is that access to public information is the crux of the matter. Irrespective of whether pacts are going to be replicated, whether their formula is going to be changed or not, observation of any public decisions, including decisions related to spending of public money, is not possible without good access to public information. And let's see what the future will bring. You mentioned the contracts. However, we also have a request to the Constitutional Court that might restrict that access very soon. And last but not least, on a personal note, would we do that again, knowing what we know now? Well, personally speaking, I'd say yes, I would, very much so. But I have a researcher's hat on my head. I work for the Warsaw School of Economics, and I think that might be a great example of a project that is related to research, but has a strong implementation element as well. It can be a source of interesting information and recommendations when it comes to management, combating corruption. Right now, I'm lecturing ethics in business, and if I get to lecture it in the future, I will definitely have material for a lot of good lectures from the story with Integrity Pacts. I'll be able to share my own experience, my own errors as well. From the point of view of the foundation, I don't have the mandate to do so. I'm not a member of the board, but I might risk the following thesis. I think that the foundation wouldn't venture out to a pilot project again. It's not that it was a bad experience, but the logics of operation of the foundation is that we try to test ideas and then recommend them to others. We tested our idea 5 years ago. Back then, the situation in the foundation was totally different. Times were different. We do see some initial fruit, but what the foundation would like to see is other CSOs, NGOs engaging in similar undertakings. What we would like to achieve is to have others follow suit, doing similar things. We are glad, however, that as an institution we generated some knowledge base for the future. It's 12:05. However, if you have any burning comments to share, please do so right now. I can give you 5 more minutes, and if not, well, I would like to thank cordially our panelists. I would like to thank our partners for being part of the Pact. Full stop. If there are no burning questions, I would like to thank you all, and we are in touch. Good luck. Good luck with the next EU financing perspective. We're not saying goodbye to Pacts. We might meet again. If not personally, we can meet under another project. Thank you once again. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you, and feel invited for the second day of our conference. Thank you once again. Thank you. Thank you very much.